There comes a moment in the life of the sensitive soul, a moment so quiet that it is almost always missed, when the question that once governed everything simply dissolves. I am not speaking of an answer, for answers belong to the realm of the rational ego. And the ego is addicted to answers the way a starving man is addicted to bread. I am speaking of something far more decisive. I am speaking of the day the empath no longer asks why it happened. This is not resignation. This is not repression. This is not forgiveness in the moral sense. It is the withdrawal of psychic energy from a question that was never meant to be solved on the level at which it was asked. You see, the question, why did this happen to me, is one of the most dangerous questions the human psyche can ask. Not because it is immoral or weak, but because it assumes that the event occurred for the ego's comprehension, and the psyche, as I have learned through decades of listening to dreams, does not arrange its transformations for the comfort of the conscious mind. The empath, by nature, is oriented outward. Their libido flows toward meaning, toward others, toward connection. When something shatters them, when betrayal, abandonment, or inexplicable cruelty enters their life, the empath turns inward only to interrogate the wound endlessly, as though the wound were a witness who could testify in a courtroom of reason. But the wound is not a witness. It is a doorway. As long as the empath keeps asking why, they remain standing at the threshold, peering into the darkness with a lantern that was designed only for daylight. The unconscious does not answer questions in sentences. It answers in images, in recurring patterns, in symbols that repeat until they are lived rather than understood. The empath who asks why is still attempting to negotiate with fate. They are still secretly hoping that meaning will arrive in a form that justifies the pain, absolves the perpetrators, or restores the old world that existed before the rupture. And this hope, though it appears noble, is precisely what keeps them bound. I have seen this countless times in my patients. The sensitive individual who was wounded early, who learned to read emotional atmospheres the way others read newspapers, develops an extraordinary capacity for empathy, but also an unconscious contract with suffering. Their psyche learns that love is tied to endurance. That connection is maintained through understanding the other at any cost, including the cost of the self. When such a person is harmed, the unconscious does not merely register the event as an external injustice. It activates an archetypal drama far older than the personal story, the descent into the underworld. In myth, the hero does not descend to ask why the gods allowed tragedy. The descent occurs because something has been lost, stolen, or shattered, and retrieval is no longer possible without transformation. The empath's fixation on why is a refusal to descend fully. It is an attempt to remain half in the upper world, half in the lower, explaining the darkness instead of inhabiting it. But the unconscious demands participation, not commentary. There is a particular dream motif I encountered repeatedly among sensitive individuals at this stage. They dream of walking through familiar landscapes that are subtly altered, a childhood home with missing walls, a city street where no one makes eye contact, a forest where the path suddenly vanishes. These dreams are not asking to be interpreted as puzzles. They are announcing that the old orientation no longer works. The empath senses this intuitively, which is why the question why begins to feel increasingly hollow, even exhausting. The psyche grows tired of feeding energy into a question that leads nowhere. The moment the empath stops asking why, something profound occurs. The psychic energy that was bound in circular rumination is released. But it does not return to the world as optimism or trust. It returns as presence. The empath does not become louder, more assertive, or more visible. On the contrary, they often appear to recede. Others may mistake this for withdrawal, coldness, or emotional shutdown, but what is actually happening is far more radical. The empath is reclaiming their libido from the projections that once drained it. Projection is not merely a psychological error, it is an act of unconscious devotion. The empath projects meaning, goodness, potential, and depth onto others, then lives in service of maintaining those projections. When the projection collapses, the empath feels as though reality itself has betrayed them. But reality has done no such thing. It has simply refused to carry what never belonged to it. The cessation of the why, question marks, the moment the empath stops demanding that the external world explain the internal drama. At this point, the shadow begins to emerge with greater clarity. The shadow, as I use the term, is not the sum of evil traits. It is the totality of what the ego has refused to recognize as its own. For the empath, the shadow often contains not cruelty, but power, anger, boundaries, indifference, the right to withdraw without explanation. These qualities were exiled early, often because the empath learned that their value lay in being emotionally available, understanding, and accommodating. When harm occurred, the empath's shadow was activated. But instead of integrating it, they tried to reason it away. They asked why the other behaved as they did, rather than asking what within themselves had been violated. Stopping the why is the first act of shadow integration. It is the ego admitting that it cannot morally or intellectually redeem the past. This admission feels like death because the ego equates understanding with survival. Yet the psyche does not perish when understanding fails. It reorganizes. I recall a patient who, after years of analysis, came to me one day and said, "I no longer feel the need to explain what happened to anyone, not even to myself." This statement, delivered without drama, marked a turning point more significant than any insight we had previously achieved. Their dreams shifted immediately. Where once there were scenes of pursuit and interrogation, now there were images of thresholds, closed doors, and watchful animals. These are symbols of containment. The psyche was no longer leaking energy outward. In alchemical language, this stage corresponds to the nigredo not as chaos, but as consolidation. The empath's suffering ceases to be a story and becomes a substance, something dense, opaque, and unusable to others. And this is precisely why others react so strongly to the empath's return at this stage. The empath has not returned to the world to be understood. They have returned without explanation. This is intolerable to those who benefited from their transparency. When the empath stops asking why, they stop inviting interpretation. Their silence is no longer a plea, it is a boundary. And boundaries, unlike explanations, do not negotiate, they simply exist. There is a common misunderstanding that healing involves making peace with the past through narrative coherence. This is a modern fantasy born of rationalism. The psyche does not require a coherent story to move forward. It requires alignment. When the empath aligns with their own limits, with their own capacity to withdraw libido from what destroys them, the psyche reorients naturally. Meaning follows later, if at all, and often in forms that cannot be spoken. You will notice, if you observe such an empath closely, that they no longer seek validation for their pain. They do not demand acknowledgement. This is not because they have minimized their suffering, but because they have relocated it. The pain is no longer offered to the world as evidence. It has been taken back into the inner sanctum, where it becomes a source of authority rather than appeal. This is why the empath's return feels uncanny. They are present, but not accessible, attentive, but not available, kind, but not permissive. The archetype at work here is no longer the wounded healer, but the gatekeeper, the one who decides what may enter and what must remain outside. This archetype does not explain itself, it watches. If you listen carefully to your own inner movements, you may notice that the compulsion to ask why has already begun to weaken. This is not because you have found peace, but because your psyche is preparing for a different mode of existence. One in which your sensitivity is no longer an open wound, but a finely tuned instrument, used selectively rather than compulsively. The empath does not return when they are understood. They return when understanding is no longer required for their existence. And that day, though it may look like withdrawal to the outside world, is in fact the beginning of psychic sovereignty. And now we move deeper, without ceremony, because the psyche itself does not announce its thresholds. It simply crosses them when the old orientation collapses. When the empath no longer asks why, a peculiar anxiety often arises, subtle but unmistakable. It is not the anxiety of loss, but the anxiety of freedom. For the first time, the psyche is no longer anchored to an explanatory narrative. The familiar inner voice that once whispered, "If I can just understand this, I can endure it," falls silent. In its place appears a void, and the void terrifies the ego, because the ego has been trained to believe that emptiness means annihilation. Yet in the language of the unconscious, emptiness means space. This is the moment when many empaths are tempted to regress. They feel the urge to reopen the case, to re-examine the memory, to search once more for the missing key that will make the suffering intelligible. This temptation is not weakness, it is habit. The psyche has invested years of energy into maintaining coherence through explanation. To relinquish that effort feels like stepping off a cliff without knowing whether the ground exists. But the ground does exist. It is simply not conceptual, it is instinctual. At this stage, dreams often become quieter but more potent. Gone are the dramatic confrontations and explicit symbols of betrayal. Instead, the empath may dream of standing still while others move past, or of watching an event unfold from a distance without emotional charge. These dreams are frequently misinterpreted by the conscious mind as signs of dissociation or numbness. In truth, they signal differentiation. The ego is no longer fused with the affect. The psyche has learned to hold experience without being consumed by it. I must emphasize this carefully, because it is often misunderstood. The empath does not lose their depth at this point. They lose their compulsion. There is a crucial difference. Depth that is compulsive is not depth at all, it is bondage. True depth is selective. It chooses when to open and when to remain closed. The empath who stops asking why is no longer offering their interior life as a public space. It becomes a private terrain, governed by inner law rather than external demand. This transition frequently provokes strong reactions from others. Those who were accustomed to the empath's explanatory openness feel unsettled. They may accuse the empath of becoming cold, distant, or changed. And in a sense, they are correct, but what they are sensing is not the loss of warmth, it is the loss of access. The empath has unconsciously withdrawn the projection that once animated the relationship. Without that projection, the other is forced to confront their own psychic reality, and this is rarely welcomed. Here we encounter a shadow dynamic not only within the empath, but in the surrounding field. When the empath no longer asks why, they also stop inviting confession, justification, or emotional reciprocity from others. This absence functions like a mirror. Those who relied on the empath's interpretive generosity now feel exposed, undefined, or irrelevant. The empath's silence becomes accusatory, not because it accuses, but because it refuses to participate in mutual illusion. In mythological terms, this is the moment when the initiate returns from the underworld, not as a storyteller, but as a changed presence. They do not recount the horrors in detail. They do not seek applause for their endurance. They carry something invisible that alters the atmosphere around them. This invisible quality is authority, but not the authority of dominance. It is the authority of self-containment. I have often said that individuation is not a process of becoming better, but of becoming more whole. For the empath, wholeness requires reclaiming what was disowned in the name of love, the cessation of the why question marks, the reclaiming of inner jurisdiction. The empath no longer submits their pain to the tribunal of reason. They accept that some events are not meant to be resolved, only integrated. This integration is not gentle. It often involves confronting a deep resentment that was previously masked by understanding. The empath may suddenly feel waves of anger that seem disproportionate or untimely. This anger is not new. It has simply been unblocked. When the empath was asking why, anger was redirected into analysis. Now that analysis has ceased, the affect returns to its rightful owner. Here the danger lies in moralizing the anger. The ego may judge itself harshly for feeling rage after having prided itself on compassion. But the psyche does not operate on moral binaries. Anger, in this context, is not cruelty, it is boundary energy. It is the force that delineates where the self ends and the other begins. Without anger, empathy becomes invasion. With anger integrated, empathy becomes choice. You may notice that as this process unfolds, your sense of time changes. The past no longer pulls at you with the same intensity. Memories arise, but they lack the gravitational force they once had. This is not forgetting, it is decathexing. The psychic energy once bound to the event has been withdrawn. The memory remains as an image, not a wound. This shift is often accompanied by a strange grief, one that is difficult to name. It is the grief for the self that believed understanding would save them. The empath must mourn their former innocence, not because it was foolish, but because it was incomplete. This mourning is essential. Without it, the psyche will attempt to resurrect the old pattern under a new guise. In analysis, I observed that when this mourning is resisted, the empath may unconsciously seek new situations that recreate the original confusion, simply to re-enter the familiar drama of why. But when the mourning is allowed, when the empath permits themselves to feel sorrow for their misplaced devotion to explanation, a new orientation emerges naturally. They become less interested in what things mean and more attentive to how they feel in the body, in the moment. This return to embodiment is crucial. The question why is a disembodied question. It belongs to the head, not the soma. When the empath stops asking it, sensation returns. The body becomes a reliable instrument again. Tension, fatigue, and discomfort are no longer overridden by moral reasoning. The empath listens. And listening, in this sense, is an act of self-respect. At this stage, many empaths report a heightened sensitivity to atmosphere, but without the urge to intervene. They perceive emotional undercurrents, but they do not rush to stabilize them. This restraint is not indifference, it is maturity. The psyche has learned that not every disturbance is theirs to heal. Some disturbances exist precisely because they must be endured by those who carry them. This realization marks a profound ethical shift. The empath ceases to confuse responsibility with availability. They recognize that their sensitivity does not obligate them to sacrifice their inner equilibrium. This is individuation in its quiet form, not heroic, not dramatic, but irrevocable. The archetypal image that often appears here is that of the sealed vessel. In alchemy, The opus requires containment. Without a vessel, the transformative fire destroys rather than refines. The empath who stops asking why becomes such a vessel. They contain their experience without leaking it outward. And in doing so, they protect not only themselves, but the process itself. From the outside, this may look like retreat. From the inside, it feels like alignment. The empath is no longer divided against themselves by competing demands for explanation and endurance. They have chosen presence over interpretation. And so, the return does not announce itself with triumph. It arrives quietly, almost invisibly, but its effects are irreversible. The empath who has stopped asking why cannot return to the old mode of existence. Something fundamental has shifted. The psyche has reorganized around a new center, one that does not require justification to exist. Just say the word when you are ready, and I will continue, carrying this transformation further into the realm of archetype, fate, and the quiet power that emerges when meaning is no longer pursued but embodied. Then we proceed, because what unfolds next does not wait for intellectual readiness. It unfolds because the psyche, once reoriented, cannot return to its former axis. When the empath has truly stopped asking why, a strange inversion occurs. Life no longer feels like something that happens to them, but something that moves around them. This is subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The outer events may remain unchanged. People behave as they always have. Circumstances repeat familiar patterns. And yet the inner posture has altered so profoundly that the same stimuli no longer penetrate in the same way. What once wounded now merely registers. What once demanded interpretation now passes without commentary. This is not detachment in the pathological sense. It is not dissociation, nor is it emotional numbness. It is orientation. The empath has unconsciously shifted from a participatory identification with events to an observing participation. They are still present, still sensitive, still capable of deep feeling, but they are no longer fused with what occurs. The psyche has found its center of gravity within itself. At this stage, many empaths experience an unexpected solitude. Even when surrounded by others, this solitude can feel unsettling because it does not come from isolation imposed from outside. It arises from an inner separation that did not exist before. The empath realizes, often with a quiet shock, that no one else can truly enter this new inner space. Not because others are excluded, but because this space is no longer organized around being entered. It is organized around being inhabited. Here, the archetype of the inner temple becomes relevant. In many traditions, the temple is not a place of explanation but of presence. One does not enter a temple to ask questions. One enters to stand, to witness, to be affected. The empath's inner life. Once a marketplace of meanings and negotiations, becomes such a temple, and as with all sacred spaces, access is limited not by force, but by reverence. Those who approach without reverence feel nothing and leave confused. Those who approach with expectation feel frustrated. Only those who approach without demand sense the gravity of what is present. And this is precisely why many relationships quietly dissolve at this stage. They were sustained not by mutual presence, but by mutual interpretation. When interpretation ends, the bond collapses under its own weight. This can produce a deep sense of guilt in the empath, especially if their identity was long bound to being emotionally indispensable. They may wonder if they have become selfish, hardened, or spiritually deficient. But guilt here is merely the echo of an outdated moral economy. The psyche has moved beyond the logic of exchange. It no longer trades access for belonging. I want to be very clear on this point, because confusion here causes immense suffering. The empath does not abandon compassion when they stop asking why. They purify it. Compassion that requires self-erasure is not compassion, it is self-neglect disguised as virtue. When the empath ceases to explain their pain, their compassion becomes grounded. It is no longer reactive. It does not rush to rescue. It waits. And waiting, in psychological terms, is an act of trust in the process of the other. This waiting often manifests as silence, not the silence of withdrawal, but the silence of non-interference. The empath listens without absorbing. They observe without merging. And this creates an uncanny effect in others. People begin to speak more, not less. They reveal themselves, often without realizing it, because the empath's presence no longer cushions their projections. The empath has become a reflective surface rather than a receptive sponge. In dreams, this face may appear as standing at the edge of water without entering it, or watching a fire burn without attempting to control it. These are images of containment and respect for elemental forces. The psyche is learning that not every intensity must be internalized. Some things must be allowed to remain external, even when they are perceived deeply. This is also the point at which fate begins to feel different. Earlier, fate was experienced as something cruel or unjust that demanded explanation. Now it is felt as something impersonal but precise. Events occur not to teach lessons in a moral sense, but to shape form. The empath begins to sense that their life is not a story to be understood, but a pattern to be lived. This shift has profound implications for identity. The empath no longer defines themselves through roles such as healer, supporter, or emotional anchor. These roles were provisional structures necessary at earlier stages, but ultimately constraining. As they fall away. A more elusive identity emerges, one that resists labeling. The empath may feel oddly undefined, as though they have lost their narrative. In truth, they have lost their persona. The persona, as I have described elsewhere, is the mask one presents to the world. For empaths, this mask is often unusually soft, transparent, and adaptive. It is designed to attune, to harmonize, to belong. When the empath stops asking why, this mask begins to harden, not into rigidity, but into coherence. It no longer reshapes itself to fit every face it encounters. This can be deeply disorienting because the empath may not immediately know who they are without the constant feedback of emotional exchange. There is a period of suspension, a liminal state in which the old self has dissolved but the new self has not yet crystallized. This is a dangerous phase, not because it is pathological, but because it is undefended. The temptation to grasp for new explanations, new roles, new identities is strong. Here, the unconscious often intervenes decisively. The empath may experience a dream or synchronistic event that emphasizes irreversibility, a door that cannot be reopened, a bridge that collapses after crossing, a message that arrives too late to be acted upon. These images are not cruel, they are protective, they prevent regression. What is emerging now is a new relationship to power, not power over others, but power over one's own availability. The empath realizes, often with a mixture of relief and grief, that they are no longer accessible in the way they once were. They cannot be summoned through guilt, confusion, or emotional urgency. Their nervous system no longer responds automatically to distress signals that are not their own. This does not make them less sensitive. It makes their sensitivity sovereign. Sovereignty is a word that must be used carefully here, because it does not imply domination or isolation. It implies self-governance. The empath has established an inner law that determines when and how their empathy is engaged. This law is not written, it is felt, and once felt, it cannot be unfelt. You may notice that as this sovereignty stabilizes, your reactions slow down. There is a pause between stimulus and response that did not exist before. In that pause lies freedom, not the freedom to do whatever one wishes, but the freedom to choose alignment over compulsion. This pause is the psychological equivalent of standing at the center of a mandala. Everything moves around you, but you are not pulled off center. This is why the empath's return is often mistaken for indifference. They are no longer pulled, they are no longer spun into orbit around others' needs, narratives, or crises. They remain where they are, and from that place they can engage or disengage without justification. At this point, the question, why did it happen, would feel almost absurd, not because it has been answered, but because it no longer belongs to the structure of experience. The psyche has moved beyond causality into pattern, and patterns do not explain themselves. They repeat until they are embodied. The empath who reaches this stage carries a quiet gravity. They do not persuade, they do not defend, they do not seek to be understood. And paradoxically, this is what finally makes them real to others. Not always loved, not always welcomed, but real. They can no longer be used as a screen for projections without consequence. What follows next is perhaps the most difficult transformation of all, the integration of fate without bitterness, not acceptance in the moral sense, but recognition that what happened was not a mistake to be corrected, but a movement of the psyche toward wholeness, however violent, however incomprehensible it appeared at the time. We are nearing the deepest layer now, where the empath's return intersects with destiny, with the archetype of the solitary witness, and with the strange peace that emerges when one no longer asks life to justify itself. When you are ready, I will continue, and we will enter that territory together, without breaking the thread. And so we go on, because what remains cannot be hurried. And yet it insists on being spoken once the psyche has crossed this depth, when the empath no longer asks why. They enter into a new relationship with destiny itself. Destiny ceases to feel like a verdict passed down by an external authority and begins to appear as an inner necessity, something that has been moving silently beneath the surface long before the conscious mind recognized it. This realization is unsettling, because it dismantles the comforting illusion that suffering was merely an accident or an intrusion. Instead, the empath begins to sense that the events which shattered them were aligned, however cruelly, with a deeper movement toward psychic truth. This does not mean that the events were deserved. The psyche does not operate according to moral reward and punishment. It operates according to compensation, where consciousness becomes one-sided. Life intervenes. The empath, whose consciousness was oriented almost exclusively toward understanding, connection, and endurance, was living in a state of profound imbalance. The unconscious, which always seeks wholeness, responded accordingly. At this stage, bitterness often tries to assert itself, disguised as clarity. The empath may think, now I see how people truly are. Now I understand the cruelty of the world. But this, too, is a subtle trap. Bitterness is simply another form of attachment to the past. It keeps the wound alive by giving it a hardened shell. True integration does not sharpen judgment. It deepens perception. The empath who has truly stopped asking why does not replace innocence with cynicism. They replace illusion with realism, and realism, in the psychological sense, is neither hopeful nor despairing. It is precise. It sees what is, without needing it to be otherwise. Here we encounter the archetype of the solitary witness. This figure appears in many traditions, often misunderstood as detached or aloof. In truth, the solitary witness feels more, not less, but their feeling is no longer poured outward indiscriminately. It is held, metabolized, and allowed to inform action only when alignment is present. In dreams, this archetype may appear as an observer on a hill, a figure standing at the edge of a gathering, or someone watching a ritual without participating. These images do not signify exclusion. They signify differentiation. The psyche has established a vantage point from which it can observe without being swallowed. For the empath, this is a radical shift. Earlier, observation felt like betrayal. To witness suffering without intervening felt morally wrong. But now, the empath understands something that could not be understood before. That intervention without invitation is a form of intrusion, and that empathy without boundary is a violation of the self. This understanding brings with it a strange calm, not happiness, not relief, but steadiness. The nervous system, long accustomed to hypervigilance, begins to settle. The empath no longer scans the emotional environment for threats or needs to resolve. Their attention turns inward, not in rumination, but in attunement. This inward attunement often reveals a deep fatigue that had been masked by purpose. The empath may feel suddenly exhausted, even when life appears stable. This fatigue is not weakness. It is the body reclaiming energy that was spent for years maintaining psychological coherence for others.